Okay, hi everyone. We'll make a start. So, welcome to the launch of mine and Dr. Jonathan Wistow of Durham University's book launch, Levelling Up the UK Economy, the Need for Transformative Change, which was published by Palgrave around 2 or so weeks ago now. The book takes a historical look at the evolution of the UK's left behind places problem, touching upon key themes, particularly around the political economy, social class, geographical inequalities, and place-based social problems. It was written quite quickly together with Jonathan at the start of this year and was fast-tracked publications part of Palgrave Pivot series. So it draws on a range of data sources, but particularly fills a gap in knowledge around a lack of qualitative research in the UK's left behind places. Now, our collaboration and ongoing work very much stems from about 6 years ago now, I think, when I was a master's student at Durham and Jonathan was my supervisor. So the book very much brings together kind of key parts of our work in the years since. So the structure of today is that we'll talk for about 45 minutes or so, and we'll leave a bit of room at the end, 15 or so minutes for any questions, and we'll pick them up in the chat bar at the end. So I'm going to first start by outlining a bit of a whistle-stop tour, to be honest, of the importance of history in understanding the evolution of left behind places. Jonathan will then go on to talk about the levelling up strategy and local governance in relation to levelling up. And then I'll close with a look at some of the problems in a left behind place that we focused on that forms a key kind of focus of the book. So just to outline some historical context for 5 or so minutes then, which the book particularly deals with in chapter 2. It's well established now that the UK is one of the most regionally unequal and imbalanced nations in the developed world, with some evidence indicating that it has the highest level of regional inequality out of all of the westernized wealthy nations, and that its economic and geographical imbalances are more representative of a poorer developing country rather than a supposed advanced economy. Now, a key feature of the UK's geographical unevenness is that these place-based inequalities exist not only within regions and sub-regions, but also within and across local authority areas. Now, this has been clear for some time, as the literature attests, but the UK's kind of geographical unevenness particularly burst into popular and public consciousness in light of a range of social and political developments. So the first one in particular was the 2016 Brexit vote, which was cast by many economic geographers as kind of representative of the country's geography of discontent. There was also the 2019 collapse of the Red Wall, whereby areas from parts of North Wales right up to areas in the northeast of England that had historically voted Labour returned the Tory MP, sometimes for the first time in their electoral history. And it was also elucidated by the COVID-19 pandemic, where deprived localities tended to do far worse in terms of COVID-19 infections and COVID-related mortalities. So place and social class are very much central to the UK's geographical imbalances and the levelling up agenda, central to a range of social, economic and political and cultural outcomes. Now, particularly central to this is what's been conceptualised as the UK's left behind localities. Now, while there is a degree of geographical variation in the evolution of these places, they're generally defined by kind of relative social, economic and cultural decline, political discontent, particularly a rise in non-voting since the turn of the millennium onwards, but also support for more nationalistic causes, particularly in recent years, like Brexit, for instance, back in 2016, as well as the 2019 collapse of the so-called Red Wall. Local labour markets tend to be characterised by higher prevalence of low-income employment opportunities, deindustrialization, depopulation, particularly of younger residents, poor mental and physical health, and low levels of highly skilled and professionalized jobs, and higher than national average rates of deprivation, crime, poverty, antisocial behaviour, and other forms of social problems. So while the book focuses heavily on one particular left behind place, and it owns in on this locality and local authority, it's worth pointing out that these locales are a global phenomenon. It's not just confined to the UK or Northern England. They're particularly prevalent in parts of France, Germany, Holland, Italy, Northern Czech Republic, Hungary, as well as in cities across the United States of America's so-called Rust Belt, Minneapolis, Detroit, and so on, which of course many of those voted heavily for Donald Trump back in 2016. So one of the kind of key localities that we focus on in the book as an empirical case study is Redcar and Cleeveland, which is a local authority area in Teesside in the northeast of England. Now, this was one part of data collection, which involved 25 interviews with local residents, and Jonathan will mention the other kind of small-scale scoping study shortly. But to cut a long historical story short, Redcar and Cleeveland is situated next to the North Yorkshire Moors National Park, which lies to the south, with Middlesbrough to the west and the North Sea coastline to the east. It was created as a local authority area back in 1974 and is populated by various towns and villages. Now, the area's history is very much tethered to the broader development of Teesside as an industrial powerhouse during large parts of the 19th and 20th century. As two local businessmen found what was cast as a magnificent supply of workable ironstone in the Cleveland Hills in 1850, the area became home to what was known as its Great Iron and Steel Rush. And by the close of the 19th century, around 140 blast furnaces had been built in the sub-region. Now, people emigrated to the area to acquire manufacturing work and take advantage of this burgeoning economy, including from places like Ireland and Devon to the south of England. And such an economic boom meant that it gradually became defined by its manufacturing base. So it was described, for instance, by the former British Prime Minister William Gladstone as a remarkable place. So Teesside, Redcar and Cleeveland was central to the uneven spatial and capitalist development of the early 19th century. Some places benefited from this and expanded and pulled ahead in comparison to others. So this was, though, the era of laissez-faire capitalism. Despite this spatial development, it was generally a time of profound inequality, deprivation, to an extent, slum-like conditions. And workers, laboured in incredibly harsh and difficult conditions, weren't provided with economic and social stability. And as we can see on the point on the slide at the bottom there, it wasn't really until a combination of crises, the Great War, the 1929 Great Depression, the threat posed by fascism across the continent, and as well growing support for ideological alternatives, actually different ways of organising our economy and social life, that industrial workers in places like Redcar and Cleveland started to reap the rewards of their labour, giving rise to capitalism's post-war period. Now, obviously, there are some nuances around this, but generally speaking, successive governments worked towards what was known as the class compromise, a balance between employers and labour. We had quite radical developments over those decades, particularly after the immediate years after the war, the construction of the NHS, the welfare state, kind of control of the commanding heights of the economy and key industries governmentally, unprecedented union power, state intervention in markets, and heavy regulation of business activities. And as a result of that political and economic anomaly in capitalism's history, geographical inequalities and economic inequality more broadly narrowed. This was the first time in the history of capitalism that but that occurred. Now, that's not representative of capitalism's normal functioning. It was really an aberration in history brought by a really unique set of structural conditions. So soon as the political economy was able to, it embarked upon a phase shift, what Jonathan Turton in his new book terms a phase shift in the UK political economy towards the neoliberalisation of the economy and social life more broadly, which has generally been set, particularly from a Marxian perspective, upon restoring power and wealth to those that had always had it really throughout history, but had it temporarily constrained in those couple of decades in the middle of the 20th century. So again, while there are some nuances around this, generally speaking, successive governments have been committed to deindustrialisation, the abandonment of full employment as a policy goal, privatisation of state assets, many of which had historically existed outside of capitalist markets, and a general kind of prioritisation of market forces over the citizenry's social and economic needs. Now, the implications for place were obviously huge. I mean, in the immediate years of the Thatcherite neoliberal programme, of course, we had the mass unemployment, particularly in parts of the north and in parts of Redcar and Cleeveland and Teesside. As Redcar and Cleveland local economy was heavily deindustrialised. Places that were very much kind of built up around industry as their raison d'etre, particularly in the northeast, like Redcar and Cleveland, gradually fell way behind parts of London and the southeast's living standards. Now, Redcar and Cleveland was identified last year by Ron Martin and colleagues as the second most left behind local authority area in terms of the differential growth of both employment and output. And it's worth me just briefly pointing out that, whilst London suffered heavily from deindustrialisation in the 1980s, the capital has been able to use its position as a centre for global finance capital to reinvent itself, particularly after the Big Bang Thatcherite deregulation in 1986, with the capital obtaining a disproportionate number of really well-paid jobs in financial services and professional business, and has become really kind of heavily centralised around policy and politics and centralisation, governance-wise more broadly. So our kind of political economy since the 80s has very much been premised on the supposed benefits of global competition and free markets and a laissez-faire approach to London's financial expansion, based upon the idea that wealth will just trickle out magically to the rest of the nation and places like Redcar and Cleveland. But of course, we know that the empirical evidence on that, points to the contrary. Places, particularly in the north, have simply been left behind. And we've witnessed the emergence of embedded and systemic structural problems, resulting in the north-south divide, which is a key part of the UK's spatial imbalances. But again, that is somewhat simplistic, as many scholars have pointed out. London, as we know, possesses the highest concentrated poverty rate in the UK. And of course, the north is not homogenous in the sense that, wherever you really go, you get pockets of affluence side by side, quite deeply ingrained pockets of deprivation, including within Redcar and Cleveland and Teesside.
I'll take over. Thanks, Luke. The history Luke has just described, it really matters for the scale and extent of the problem that the levelling up agenda is seeking to address, and for how the economy, society and policy are configured and how these then interact at different scales. And in the book, we're interested in the trajectories of place in particular, and we explore this within a complex systems framing. So in this respect, in this kind of understanding, place is highly significant, as Luke said, for a range of social and economic outcomes. And this then constitutes a key component of the material reality shaping people's lives, their quality of life, their experiences. And by thinking about place, this also draws our attention to interactions across different spatial hierarchies, including the notion of multi-level governance systems and how policy functions across those. Figure 1.1, which is in the book, in the first chapter of the book, and on the right-hand side of the side of the slide here, is a way of capturing these kinds of dynamics. And we do so in a non-exhaustive way, but it allows us then to look at different levels of analysis and identify key actors and what we call dominant system logic and how this operates at these different levels. By taking a complex systems framing, we're interested in the interactions between these things, but we're also interested in the feedback between all these levels. But our view in general is that there is a feed down this hierarchy, and this is stronger than the agency feeding up. So, for example, the political economy at the macro and the meso level, at the global and the national level, in other words, in the UK has witnessed a transition to a form of post-industrial neoliberal and rentier capitalism, as Luke has just outlined. And then this has influence over the system logic at different levels of analysis too. So we can say that central government has in general imposed a system of contracting out and commissioning of services on local government, which has contributed to the emergence of a local governance system and a plurality of actors at this level. And as a further example, we have residents in places like Redcar and Cleeveland that have very limited control over global industrial and manufacturing employment trends, but they experience these consequences quite considerably. So the figure reflects our approach to understanding the levelling up agenda and the nature of the left behind problem it's seeking to address. And it does so by integrating different types of research and knowledge. So we have a range of literature in our literature review stemming from, well, including but not limited to economic geography, post-industrialism and class, political economy, social policy, and local and regional government studies. We also outline and analyse the levelling up white paper in the book, and I'll move on to do this shortly today. And then we also have primary qualitative data collection. We have a small scoping study of interviews with 5 directors of regeneration in left behind areas as defined by the Martin et al. Classification Luke mentioned earlier, and a larger qualitative study of residents in Redcar and Cleveland. It's important to say that the local government officers weren't from Redcar and Cleveland, and I'm happy to talk about that a bit more, but that would have posed greater ethical challenges in terms of getting access for such a quick study that we did. So next slide, please. Chapter 3 of the book focuses explicitly on the levelling up agenda. And in the first part of this, we look at the agenda prior to the launch of the white paper. And drawing on the literature, some of the interviews from the scoping study and our own analysis, we identify a number of key criticisms about the agenda at this stage prior to the launch of the white paper. And the central one really is that there was a real lack of clarity about what levelling up means. This was probably the most notable feature of the policy agenda. It was variously described as being incoherent, ambiguous, internally inconsistent, having limited substance, and unlikely to lead to the transformative change that it was seeking to achieve. Even the website Conservative Home said no one knows what levelling up means. Another area of criticism was a lack of clarity about new powers for local leaders, potentially reflecting a lack of trust in the local level in the central local dynamic. Also, the agenda and most of the funding announcements for the agenda were not announced prior to the white paper. The funding linked to the additional funding linked to the levelling up agenda amounts to approximately £25 billion, but this includes 12 billion in lending from the UK Investment Bank. The time period for the funding streams is variable, but this sort of total sum is roughly relates to about 5 years, a 5-year period, and does so across a number of schemes, including the Levelling Up Fund, the Towns Fund, and the Skills Fund. The funding allocation then has been criticised for having a strong skew towards capital funds through time-consuming competitive bidding processes, rather than a model based on central allocation of revenue funding to local government and to local leaders. This model then is considered to contribute to a focus on symbols as a form of regeneration in terms of large capital built projects, rather than focusing on deprivation and the lower level of spatial concentrations of this. In general, people said there has been an insufficient focus on deprivation. One of the participants in our scoping study called the formula for calculating need for the Shared Prosperity Fund as a bastardized version of the IMD, because it did not include low household income or low employment numbers in the calculation. Similarly, Rishi Sunak boasted during the Tory leadership hustings in Tunbridge Wells about managing to change the funding allocation formula to make sure areas like Tunbridge Wells were getting the funding they deserved. So deprivation and inequality are seemingly then being deliberately marginalised in the funding for levelling up. There have also been generally quite widespread accusations of cronyism, gerrymandering and pork barrel politics around the allocation of competitive funding streams, with the Secretary of State, Jenrick, and his junior minister signing off payments to towns in each other's constituencies, and dozens of Conservative areas were placed in the top tier for assistance despite their relative affluence. In addition, a final criticism around the funding is a total lack of recognition or insight about the significance of the period of austerity predating the levelling up agenda and the impact that this has had on levelling up places. And in particular, this being regressive around deprivation and falling particularly heavily on local government as a key institution. However, it is the case, though, that on the positive side, and despite considerable policy churn over the years, this is a policy area in need of serious development. There is a real problem here. Given the highly centralised nature of the UK economy Luke's described and the long-standing spatial disparities it produces, these issues matter politically, and they matter in terms of economic and social outcomes. And in this respect, at least, the levelling up agenda has been conditionally welcomed by some key commentators. Next slide, please. So the white paper was much delayed and launched in February 22. And it forms the second part of our third chapter, and in that we focus on three key elements of this: the systems, capitals, and missions. And we do that here too. Next slide again, please. Yeah. In terms of systems reform, the white paper says local economies are complex systems shaped by cumulative, interconnected economic, social, and institutional factors. This then is part of a turn towards systems thinking, and in particular, rhetoric about systems thinking. The table here on the right illustrates 5 lessons from past policy and 5 pillars that respond to these that underpin the policy regime. And there's nothing inherently wrong in this framing. For example, the first lesson identifies a lack of policy sufficiency and then builds a pillar around medium-term missions to address these in terms of addressing long-term complex societal change. However, as an approach to systems reform, we argue that they don't go far enough in terms of tackling uneven spatial development, because, and despite the first chapter of the white paper itself having a generally good and detailed chapter on the history of spatial disparities in the UK, there is a very limited focus on the political economy in the consideration around systems reform, and it fails to really consider systems reform at a macro and meso level. So the complex system framing we developed, and I briefly outlined on an earlier slide, differs from the white paper because we're emphasising the significance of the system logic at the national government level, and in particular how this is influenced by neoliberal and rentier capitalism, centred on London as a global city, how this has a tendency towards anti-statism, a preoccupation with economic efficiency to seek to remove redundant capacities from social and economic systems, a tendency towards privatization and contracting out. Without focusing on these types of issues, we consider that the white paper in the systems reform in particular has led to an approach that has a narrow framing of the factors that have either causal and or contributory roles to play in the long-standing and deeply embedded nature of spatial disparities. In short, the significance of the political economy for the nature of our economic geography is too marginal in the government's formulation of systems reform. And therefore, this pays too little or insufficient attention to the next stage, which would be intervening in or seeking to change the system logic at the macro and meso levels. We conclude that policy designed to reduce spatial inequalities need to deal with, in complexity terms, the path dependencies, and in the cases of those places falling behind, the negative feedback that results from the interactions between localities and the wider political economy. Without seeking to do this, it's highly unlikely that the spatial trajectories we and many others describe will be sufficiently disrupted to prevent the continuation of what are persistently high levels of spatial inequalities. Next slide, please. So the white paper also outlines a framework of 6 capitals. These are human, financial, social, physical, intangible, and institutional. And these are used and concerned with capturing and evaluating the drivers of geographical disparities. The conceptualization of these is reasonable in the sense that it moves beyond just economic measures and look at how capitals interact in place in positive and negative ways. And they also provide a range of indicators and measures that put further meat on the bones in terms of how the government understands spatial disparities. But these heavily rely on just one source from Coyles at the Bennett Institute. And we argue it would have been much better to include research from economic geography, including the study by Martin et al. That Luke mentioned earlier, and work such as that by the UK 2070 Commission and the 2020 Marmot Reviews. Each of these provides a much better understanding of the nature and longevity of spatial disparities in the UK, and therefore they provide a more accurate understanding of the trajectory and gearing of the complex systems, which are not particularly well understood in the white paper. So we argue that by not developing an economic or sociological understanding of post-industrial place, the notion of things like accumulated capital are left unaddressed. There is no challenge to this. And the Levelling Up white paper explicitly says levelling up is not about redistribution. And our argument is by taking things like redistribution, by not understanding accumulated capital, the white paper has reduced the policy levers available to level the playing field. And then when we talk about narrowing inequalities targets across places, which many of the missions in the white paper do, then we have moving targets with the best performing, most affluent areas, the areas that have accumulated most capital, are continuing to develop their own dynamic trajectories from more favourable path dependencies on a highly uneven playing field. Next slide, please. So just quickly on the missions, there are 12 of these outlined in the white paper, which are essentially targets that generally function around narrowing health inequalities, narrowing inequalities gaps between the top and the bottom of the spatial distribution, and they do so across 4 focus areas. In so doing, they respond to some of the key criticisms of the agenda prior to the launch of the white paper. And in a short piece in BMJ around its launch, Michael Marmot wrote that the white paper sets out 12 missions that cover living standards, research and development, transport infrastructure, digital connectivity, education skills, health, well-being, pride in place, housing, crime, and local leadership. And he says what's not to like. Achieve these other 11 missions, and from his point of view, then health and health equity will improve. But he continues to say that the problem is that this reads as though The white paper reads as though it's totally divorced from the past 43 years of government in the UK, in which the Conservative Party has been in power for 30 of those and is responsible for much of the damage. And as Marmot says, the slope has increased, not levelled up since 2010. So the missions are very ambitious and could be more specific. For example, the health mission seeks to narrow the gap in healthy life expectancy, but it's not clear what thresholds will be used to determine the highest or the lowest areas. The hope was more detail would follow in the health disparities white paper, but that has been cancelled. And we should also recognise, though, in terms of these being very stretching targets, that things like health inequalities prove very difficult to narrow during the new Labour years in a much more favourable policy context, and have increased quite markedly during the austerity period. So next slide, please, and then that'll be my last slide. So just lastly, in the fourth chapter of the book, we looked at the role of local government in relation to governance and levelling up. And we did this in terms of looking at how the levelling up agenda seeks to influence governance systems at different levels. And we used local government as an entry point to understanding these things. Local government is the primary arm of local democracy and has considerable potential relative to place-based leadership. It provides accountability and democratic legitimacy at the local level and has excellent access to the knowledge, or the potential for excellent access to the knowledge needed to act on behalf of the local populations they serve. However, the highly centralised UK political economy has led to declining powers, functions and funding for local government, as is illustrated in the table on the right here by Bennett and colleagues, who describe the decline of the Sovereign Council over the past 40 years or so across areas such as education, housing, social care, transport and planning. We might interpret this then, at least in part, as a consequence of the neoliberal and anti-status system logic at the macro levels, which includes then the mass privatisation of housing through the right to buy and the shift towards commissioning rather than directly providing services for local government. Local government itself exists in our systems map between the meso and the micro level, and does so below local enterprise partnerships and combined authorities. And its decline has taken place alongside considerable policy churn and fragmentation in multi-level governance systems. The white paper's response and approach to devolution is generally upwards and away from local government. It develops a deal-based devolution approach that is contingent on local authorities entering into different degrees or different levels of combined authority. There are three of these, and this is the devolution up to the sub-regional level. There are new powers and functions on offer here, but findings from our scoping study suggested that this led to more, in quotes, clubbable local authorities and elected members being rewarded for adopting a preferred model of devolution. And for those working in combined authority areas already, the model did bring some benefits, but also some tensions around the funding awarded at combined authority level and how this was allocated or not allocated proportionate to deprivation and need. In conclusion, in terms of the role of local government, our view is the white paper is a considerable missed opportunity to strengthen local government as the local democratic arm of the state, and a missed opportunity to renew local democracy. Luke will pick up this final bullet point a bit at the end of the presentation, but in terms of local government and its potential to level up, we advocate a greater role for devolution to local government with a step change in core revenue funding allocations based on the notion of proportionate universalism, which is a term from the Marmot reviews, but essentially greater funding to areas with the greatest need and the greatest deprivation. So I'll hand back to Luke, and yeah, thanks.
Yeah, all right, thanks, Jonathan. So I'm just going to close then by offering a brief insight and a flavour really of some of the key empirical findings from the empirical case study with residents in so-called left behind Redcar and Cleeveland. So particularly the older age respondents then that I spoke to certainly spoke heavily about the former prevalence of industry in the area, very much suggested that it was far easier to get a job, and decades ago, not just any job, but a decent job that would equip you with a stake in the present and the future. The steelworks and a company called ICI, Imperial Chemicals Industry, which in its heyday in the 70s employed around 35,000 plus people in the local economy, including thousands more in the local supply chain. It had 2 sites in Teesside, one of which was on the cusp of Redcar and Cleeveland. In particular, that company was recalled very fondly for offering a great sense of kind of pride, purpose, and an identity to people that worked there. They were very much proud to be known as somebody that was employed by ICI. But these employment conditions had massively diminished in the local economy. For many local residents, they suggested it's very difficult these days to acquire work that's going to give me economic stability and social security. So what we'd witnessed over time was a shift from industrial stability to deindustrialized insecurity. While there is still undoubtedly pockets of good employment in the local authority area and across the sub-region more broadly, kind of resident sentiments were emphasized the ultra-competitive nature of acquiring well-paid work. Many had also spoke about the degradation of employment conditions and how, a lot of the happiness had evaporated from work. There was far too much focus on profit, kind of managerialists and satisfying shareholders, rather than the actual needs of the workforce. And they all generally suggested that it was quite easy to acquire work, but the constitution of the work, i.e. good work, was the key kind of issue and key difficulty. So poorly paid work was the norm in that sense. And just to give us an objective indication of that, kind of the ONS last year indicated that the average full-time workers' gross weekly pay in the local authority area stood at £511. And that's in comparison to both the North East and UK average of £547 and £613 respectively. So certainly in regards to the UK average, it lags considerably behind. So there was a deep-rooted and quite embedded sense that the area had been declining for some time, with a sense of community and neighbourliness also fraying at the seams. When I asked some respondents about, sense of community in the area, looking out for one another, many of them looked at me with a sense of bewilderment, claiming that, in comparison to decades ago, there really is no sense of community anymore. There's a sense that kind of market forces of individualism had really frayed the once brittle but relative sense of community that was in place in the area. And there was a sense of kind of social atomization and fragmentation. So this slow motion, localized decline across the neoliberal period was typified by the state of many of the local high streets. Laura, for instance, who was a dinner lady in her 60s, spoke about how, all the shops have closed and are boarded up. The high street is just all charity shops. Years ago, the market was brilliant. You could spend all day there. It's nothing like it was. A lot of these market towns aren't like they were. So whilst undoubtedly there was a degree of localized variation in the decline of the high streets, generally sentiments were based upon how they were, generally characterized by cafes, charity shops, pound shops, and increasingly in recent years, empty and boarded up stores. Places to the east of the local authority area were very much cast by participants as kind of symbolizing the left behind, these old potash and iron ore mining communities, where many suggested it was kind of like stepping back in time. These are places that time had forgotten. And there was a sense that, these areas, given how deep-rooted these problems and their decline is, that, they're a political inconvenience almost, and simply easier to ignore given the scale and depth of the state intervention and investment that would be required to resurrect them. Data on the slide by Gareth elucidates some of these trends that I've just been talking about there, and just worth pointing out that the localities, of course, within the local authority are all anonymised, as well as the participants. So crime, antisocial behaviour, particularly stuff like fly tipping, littering, verbal abuse, graffitiing, often quite offensive terms, onto pavements or public buildings, and what they believed was a general decline in basic civic manners over the last few decades, particularly over in recent years, were also key findings mentioned by all 25 respondents. Now, participants were keen to emphasise the really corrosive nature of crime and antisocial behaviour, suggesting the effects were really real, harmful, and really kind of socially corrosive and intra-class. They formed real forms of blights, really, upon their neighbourhoods, particularly in those more deprived areas where you have a clustering and concentration of structural problems. So interlaced with this then was, particularly again in those more deprived neighbourhoods, was the prevalence of problematic drug use like heroin and crack cocaine, acquisitive crime as well, quite a bit of shoplifting and burglaries. And these formed what the criminologist Steve Hall cast as kind of everyday little evils that occur in localities of permanent recession. Now, related to this, Cleveland Police Force were put in special measures back in 2019, and it emerged quite recently that they possess the worst recorded levels of crime in the UK. It's worth just pointing out that that is only the tip of the iceberg. Much crime goes unreported and unrecorded. So the dark figure of criminal activity is very much unknown. Now, locally, the police force have directed some monies and kind of various initiatives and into tackling crime, and ASB and made it a kind of policing priority, particularly antisocial behaviour. But residents generally believe that police were totally powerless in addressing a lot of these issues, claiming that they just tend to drive up and down in vans. They don't really do much, very little interaction with the public. Sometimes this was framed in a more structural sense in the context of austerity, and of course all the budget cuts that have happened in that kind of lost decades after the financial crisis of 2008. And others interestingly suggested that it was kind of a key reason why a lot of people sometimes took it into their own hands these days, again, in those more deprived neighbourhoods. And this often involved as well getting private security cameras on their houses, which really just served to kind of foster, that greater sense of localised insecurity and uncertainty and kind of social suspicion. And again, the data on the slide by Bryony, who's retired now, who did live in one of the most deprived estates out of the residents, elucidates, at least in some of her sentiments, some of the issues that have just been mentioned there. So I guess what can be done then to, resurrect these places and some of the really deep-rooted and systemic problems that we've briefly touched upon there, that we explore in more depth in the book, and ultimately, to achieve not just tinkering at the edges, but significant levelling up, and therefore significantly improving the livelihoods of, all citizens, but particularly citizens in these left-behind localities. Now, there are a range of redistributive policy measures that could be enacted, particularly at the macro and meso levels, to help ameliorate some of these problems and enable a more tractable structural context for levelling up to occur. So in particular, as the UK 2070 Commission point out, this could include a range of redistributive taxes, around place, focusing on land, for instance, wealth, income, corporation tax, particularly on excessive incomes, and at least bringing corporation tax in line with the higher level of the OECD nations. Allocating funds as well on a needs-based basis to address discrepancies in health, social, educational issues and so on, rather than this kind of competitive market-orientated funding basis that we have, particularly with the Levelling Up Fund. Return public spending proportionally to at least levels before the 2008 financial crash. I know, for instance, that the money allocated through the Levelling Up Fund to local councils who were successful in the first round of bids, as you know, it pales in comparison to the money that local councils lost in that lost decade of 2010 to 2020. However, we also argue, though, from a more political economic standpoint, that if we are serious about achieving the ideas that are set out in the white paper and ultimately significantly levelling up the UK economy and dragging it out of its kind of position as one of the most regionally imbalanced nations in the developed world, then we would require sustained governmental investment of a scale unseen in the neoliberal period, as many other scholars have pointed out on the board there. And given this and how spatial imbalances are very much tethered to neoliberalism and the urgent need for fundamental change, particularly in light of the range of other structural crises that we face as a society, which just really do seem to get worse by every passing day, not least environmental breakdown, the cost of living crisis, and all the human suffering that we have in today's UK society. It is time to construct something fundamentally new. And in the book, we argue that, moving into the future, we need to shift into a more progressive form of political economy, into a post-neoliberal world where places like Teesside could be resurrected and at the centre of something like the green industrial revolution, which of course a lot of politicians have talked about, and there are some interesting developments, but the extent and scale of it remains to be seen. Ultimately, if we don't do this, then we will continue to see places simply fall behind and left behind. And that's exactly what we're seeing at the moment with Rishi Sunak's government and Jeremy Hunt, who, of course, very much committed to the preservation of neoliberalism and all of the systemic problems that it involves, and many of which we've briefly touched on today. So the book is available to order on Springer. We thought that it wasn't coming out until the end of the year, but it came out a bit earlier, which was really quickly and nice. Can make a refreshing break in the publishing game. It explicates many of the themes in a lot more depth than we touched upon today. So please do consider purchasing it, maybe as a stocking present at Christmas. All right, so that brings us to a close. I'm just going to stop sharing. We do have a little bit of time for any questions. If you have any, just feel free to put them into the chat.
Or people can raise their hands as well if they want. There was a couple in the chat which I've addressed in the comments. Well, in the chat.
I think John Warren's raised his hand, Jonathan. I'll just allow John, feel free.
Hello, guys. I was just trying to, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, that's fine, yeah.
Thanks very much for your presentation, and it's familiar, a lot of that stuff, and has been for a long time, and it's always good to hear it restated. My question for you, I was going to try and type this, but I just put my hand up instead, is now, has levelling up, has the original idea of levelling up as it was, or whatever it was or wasn't, has that gone? Was it just something which was attached to Boris, and now Boris has gone, has levelling up gone? And if levelling up hasn't gone, what is it now? Is it the same thing or something different?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go first. I think levelling up is very much dead in the water. Yeah, dead before it even started, really, to any significant extent. I think the current government is committed to the general preservation of neoliberalism, not really interested in levelling up the UK economy and, ameliorating significant and embedded, systemic differences in the imbalance of the UK economy. I think it's interesting anyway, John, the extent to which kind of Johnson's administration was serious on levelling up.
Yeah.
There was some interesting stuff done by Ron Martin and colleagues, again, largely down in Cambridge, that compared the strategy to German reunification in light of the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And they argued that basically successive governments since 1989 have invested about 50 billion or so annually, maybe 55 billion annually to level up and solve that spatial imbalance or ameliorate it. When you look at like the funds that was allocated over here, of course, there are different streams of funding alongside the levelling up fund, but, it was, 4.8 billion, Jonathan, was it? Or something like that across 4 or 5 years. So realistically, it's a drop in the ocean to what would be required to and as I said, it's nowhere near what local councils lost.
No.
So it's kind of further entrenching, these problems rather than doing anything to resurrect them.
I'll just say, really quickly, I think it's probably gone, but people, I think in both the qualitative studies were cynical about the agenda, but it has raised some expectations, I think, at policy, local policy level, and in terms of the left behind places, red wall types of issues. So there's a political and a policy issue there that spatial politics is more on the agenda, and potentially sort of justice, equity around place as well. So that's potentially a hopeful sign from this. But I totally agree with Luke that it wasn't of the scale, and I think even without the political changes, it was never likely to meet its own sort of objectives. There's a couple more things, 3 people in the chat. So I can answer John Munro really quickly, then I think Gary Craig wants to answer a question, but I'm not optimistic about positive change in the near future, and I think Labour has to be much more radical. And Luke and I both have been meaning to read the policy document from last week, and I haven't read that yet. But the signs are they're being very cautious. And again, the scale of the challenge is such in the literature that it does require sort of significant and sustained resource. So there was a question about the interviews, I think potentially more for you, Luke, and then I think Gary Craig.
Is that by Nick Gray?
Yeah.
So I'll just quick. In terms of local residents' perceptions, we explore that in the book, and I did ask them a mixed bag. Generally kind of differing interpretations of what levelling up is and what it means and what it would mean in practice, and how could the local authority area be levelled up, meant a lot of different things. In general, though, a lot of the residents emphasised the importance of employment, talking about, how, the economic foundations of the area have been eroded. And in order to really resurrect it, we need, good paid, well paid forms of work, and work that is going to, be in the local economy for a long period of time, a sense of longevity. There was some optimism around this free port that's, developing and clearing up the old steelworks site to make way for hopefully some investment around renewables, which is of course the future. So I know some participants mentioned the wind turbine plant and maybe the blue hydrogen plant, which there are plans for around that, but it's an area that's there for more exploration, I think. I know Alex Hall at Northumbria is doing some interesting stuff around that, and I know a couple of other people are also, John Tomini and so on, also wrote some interesting stuff about how the job projections of free ports are, under the Tory administration, they're way out of kilt with the reality. So time will tell, I guess, what happens with that one. Jonathan, did you want to, Gary Craig?
Can you get in, Gary? Because you've.
Yeah, I should be able to do
Ah, there we
that.
go. Yep.
Can you hear
Gary,
me?
are you there?
Yep.
Can you hear me? Yep. Okay. Right. Yeah. I mean, it's obviously this whole thing is very complex, and there are all kinds of questions about the extent to which the economy of the Northeast was integrated into the national economy or not, and so on and so forth. But if you take the lies, I was going to say the promises, the lies associated with Brexit and this whole levelling up agenda, yeah, a lot of people in the Northeast have bought into it. And it's a kind of mythology in a way, because levelling up suggests that we're going back to where we were or where we ought to be. As far as I'm concerned, there never was a time when the Northeast was, as it were, on a par with the economy of the Southeast and London. And yet there is this promise in the language that's used by government. And I wish we'd stop using this notion of levelling up and all the terms associated with it, because I think they're nonsensical, and they're also very ahistorical. I mean, in a sense, what we're talking about is yet another iteration of regional policy. And there are plenty of examples of the failures of regional policy dotted around the Northeast. People probably don't need me to remind them of them, but let's take one example. You know, Team Valley Industrial Estate was an attempt to bring investment to the Northeast when the writing was already beginning to be on the wall for the major industries of the Northeast, such as coal mining, engineering and shipbuilding, of which Teesside had its share. Now, if we regarded this as I say, just another iteration of regional policy, it might be at least a little bit more honest, and we might be able to compare it more properly with what's gone before. I mean, essentially, regional policy was an attempt to compensate for the flight of capital from the Northeast, either to London and the Southeast and transforming from industrial capital into finance capital, or indeed going abroad. And we had a very clear example of that when I was working on Teesside in the Vickers engineering works, where investment was steadily shifted to Southeast Asia, to low wage or more productive centres, and the Northeast works of Vickers were allowed to run down. And what government again tried to do was subsidise Vickers for a while until they finally worked out that actually they were simply pouring money into the pockets of shareholders. That story has been going on for a long, long time. So I won't go on about it, but I do think we ought to stop buying in to this levelling up or left behind. Again, left behind, you know, as far as I'm concerned, the Northeast was always behind. So
Okay. So let's
just one last point. People unfortunately have bought into this myth, hence the electoral results in the last general election, where they think somehow something new and dynamic is going to happen, which is going to bring us back to where we ought to be or where we were. We never were.
So let's respond quickly. I'll let Luke in. So I agree with quite a bit of what you're saying. I wouldn't agree that people in the Northeast have bought into Brexit or the levelling up agenda in the way that you just describe. I would say that they haven't. What they haven't done is they haven't bought into sort of the dominant way that policy and politics has done. And these are often viewed really as sort of protest votes as well. And I think it's certainly the case that the levelling up agenda is part of a continued absence of macro the management of macroeconomic policy at a regional level. And there has always been, as you say, disparities in the UK, but in the post-industrial period, these have intensified considerably, as the economic geography literature demonstrates. And that literature is basically saying what you're saying as well, that there has been an absence of a management of this transition, as Luke says, a difference in approach and a difference in the scale of approach compared with places like Germany around the reunification of the East and West. So there's an element of this being a decision within the political economy, and a decision at a very sort of a high level to manage things in a particular way, when it could have been a much more interventionist state and a much more active form of the management of capitalist trends, the disparities that capitalism produces. I don't know if you want to come back though, Luke, on any of that.
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, I guess I reiterate all Jonathan's points there. I think as well, yeah, it's definitely important not to romanticize the past. I mean, the post-war period, despite it containing some economically worthwhile components that we briefly touched upon today, of course, I mean, it was termed a golden age, and that term is still, well used in the literature, I think, but that was certainly, somewhat mythical, as Anthony Lloyd's recent book at Teesside touches upon, not least because it had various forms of cultural antagonisms, massive forms of cultural prejudice, sexism, racism, homophobia, and so on. I think economically, it's interesting, though. I mean, Middlesbrough, for instance, I'm sure in the 70s contained the third highest wages in Britain, I think, behind Aberdeen and London. So, yeah, but as Jonathan touches upon, it's the nature of those geographical inequalities, which have, since the 80s, have just, absolutely blown all out of proportion. Is it Dave Byrne, Jonathan? I think he's got his hand raised.
I can see. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think Gary Craig was just talking rubbish, by the way. The UK, the northeast of England, was the highest wage area in the UK in the late 19th and early 20th century. And Teesside was one of the highest wage areas in the UK in the 1960s. It was a very significant contributor to the entire UK GDP, much of which was associated with ICI. As you pointed out, John Warren's research shows about the nature of employment at ICI and the way in which that operated. But the point I want to make particularly is it's interesting to see that the nature of the politics, right? I remember a woman called Maureen Taylor, who was one of the most significant political actors in the northeast of England, who was a working class woman from Billingham, who was very much involved with the ideas of development and change and transformation, and how that disappeared, not just through the Thatcher years, but through the Blair years. This absence of that kind of ability to say, we want to envisage our own future, which is why I placed so much emphasis on planning, on the kind of things that the structure plans and the regional strategies had to say, because there were ways of deciding about what the nature of the future would be, which operated at a subnational level. And what you're left with is a Teesside mayor who's really fitting up his mates and a bunch of independents who are Tories under any other name operating across the whole of the Teesside area. It's a very, very meagre form of political action at this point in time.
Thank you. I think, well, thank you for the comment. What should we do? We got we've run over time. What we're going to do, Luke? Should we? I think I can say I agree with Dave, and thank you for the comment. There's no need to really respond to that, I think, anymore.
I think no one else. There's no other outstanding questions. Jonathan, is there? And no one else has got their hand up. I don't think so.
Okay.
We've got one more. We'll take this last question, then we'll close.
Hi.
Hi. Yes, it's Helen here. I just wanted to know where, if we could have an email link to purchase your book and where we can re-listen to this recording, because I'd like to obviously send it out to a few other people, because I like the recommendations in there, and maybe we can push forward on some of those. So yes, if you could email the people who've attended so we know how to re-listen and forward it on. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, that should be fine. I'll be able to sort that institutionally, and I don't see that being an issue.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, we should just say thank you very much for everyone for coming along, and thanks for all the comments and questions.
Yeah, all right. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.